some colleagues that Derek invites. And then I want to actually give a special thanks to Derek for being the bridge actually between CIRU and then also ICCS. So yeah, I'm glad everything worked out. And let me begin by introducing my colleague Ulrike Lindner, who will speak first. Is that okay? We'll just follow the order here?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, and then also, I won't read everything, and then you have access to the booklet if you scan the QR code in the back. And if you're interested in their work, you can read further about them. So she's professor of modern history at the University of Cologne, and her research interests lie in comparative colonial and global history. And she has worked on comparative history of European empires, particularly on German and British colonies in Africa. And she has also addressed post-colonial approaches, issues of knowledge transfer between European empires and colonial labor, especially indentured and contract labor. So she has her publications here too, if you're interested in looking at those. And then if you're okay, I'll introduce Wen too. So after you speak, and then Wen can just go. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you especially to Chiu, Joyce, and Derek for organizing this. It's really very nice. And do you have to hold it? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, thanks for having me here, and thanks for organizing this. I talk about the question of transnational labor regulation for African workers in colonial contexts after World War I, and the paper is based on research of our social inequalities unit, and I thank especially Fabiana Kutsche from our sub-project for her research and support. And I think what I am now presenting is a telling example for the question the workshop is addressing, why endeavors of enhancing equality often produce inequality. Then the so-called scramble for Africa in the 1980s, where is it? The aim of the European colonizers was to integrate African colonies into the capitalist world economy, thereby relying strongly on the cheap labor of African people and very often on forced labor. After World War I, we have the International Labour Organization, the ILO, that was founded to improve and regulate working situations of workers all over the world. It was also seen as an answer of the Western powers to the threat of a communist revolution after the 1970 Russian Revolution. During the first years, the ILO was mainly concerned with the industrialized workers in the Western world, and its works and method were shaped by strong imperial interests that hindered the immediate emancipation of colonial workers. The ILO subsumed special regulations for workers in colonial contexts, and they used the term native labor. The term allowed them to disregard the labor standards they had for the Western industrialized nations, and these divergent regulations were justified by racist attributions, and they corresponded to the special needs of the colonial powers who were members of the ILO. Part of the discourse was the depiction of the male African worker as fundamentally unwilling to work, as lazy and undisciplined. This image, which was widespread in the colonial discourse, was used by the colonial governments as an argument for the use of strict educational and disciplinary measures that also included forced labor. I will talk today first about the stereotype of the lazy African, and then on African labor as an important resource and forced labor systems in colonial Africa. Then I will come to the ILO and this problem of forced labor before concluding my thoughts. So the first part is the stereotype of the lazy African. As I said, in the colonial possessions, the colonizers needed the indigenous people as a source of labor for their possessions, without which they would have hardly received any profit from the colonies. And furthermore, Europeans were supposedly unsuitable for manual labor in tropical countries. That was sort of the ideology. A report by the Native Commissioner in the British colony of Natal stated this as early as 1855. I quote, it would be very difficult to contemplate any kind of product of labor except skilled labor, which does not involve that of the Kafir, so the African in this district. On a farm, he does almost everything. He herds the cattle, milks the cows, churns the butter, loads it on the wagon, and so on. He digs the sluice, makes the bricks, reaps the harvest, and in the house he cooks. There is little that I ever see a farmer do but write about the country. So that's the role of the white person. Generally, the agrarian economy, agricultural exports, and the extraction of raw materials in mining only yielded profits for the colonizers with this cheap labor or sort of forced labor. And this is why the treatment of and the control over indigenous laborers became one of the most important elements of colonial policy in Africa. This was also to have a lasting impact on the discourse on African labor. In encounters with various African societies who mostly practiced subsistence farming or extensive pastoralism, the racialized perception of these Africans as lazy developed among European white travelers and later missionaries as early as the 18th century. The African, in their view, did not do any regular work like the civilized European, as he hardly had to work to feed himself in the abundance of the African continent. So the Europeans thought. And this is, of course, far removed from any African reality, but it came even more pronounced after the colonial occupation. If Africans resisted the colonial power's compulsion to work, they were automatically characterized as apathetic, unwilling, or lazy. And Whitehead convincingly shows that using the example of the Lamba in the copper belt in Zambia. And in fact, this group was able to earn the taxes imposed on them through their own sales, and they did not want to go into dependent labor. Of course, the colonial rulers categorized this as a refusal to work and as a character flaw. In the French, English, and German literature, colonial experts during high imperialism, you find this countless references and repetitions of this image of the lazy African. It became a very powerful stereotype, and it was linked to the assumption that the colonial rulers had to civilize African workers and educate them to work. And so the compulsion and forced work was dressed up as a supposed achievement of civilization. Now, my second part, African labor as an important resource. As already mentioned, Europeans relied heavily on the cheap labor of Africans, both in the plantations in East and West Africa, as well as the farming industry in South Africa, and generally in all infrastructure projects such as road and railway construction. And of course, especially in mining in South Africa, for example, you had 150,000 African workers employed only in the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg in 1909. For the colonial rulers, this was a way to integrate the African colonies into the global capitalist economy of the time and to make their colonies profitable. The Europeans developed various strategies to force what they consider to be lazy people into dependent labor. The most popular means was the hut and poor tax, which the colonial rulers introduced in almost all African colonies and which usually had to be paid in cash. And so Africans were forced into extremely poorly paid wage labor on plantations, farms, and in mines, and it caused them to migrate to areas where the demand for labor was highest. This destroyed, of course, colonial social ties and tore apart African societies and African families. The hut and poor tax was considered to be extremely successful, both for the tax revenue and for providing a labor pool. In British South Africa or in German Southwest Africa, where we had extremely racist control over the African population, this was combined with passport laws and restricted freedom of movement. And this increased significantly the control and the result, the compulsion to work. Then we have two more direct forms of forced labor in the French colonies, the corvée labor. And we have also prison labor. So people were not sitting in prisons, but they were forced to do forced labor, because that was seen as a measure for Africans to sort of to integrate them into the colonial into the into the capitalist colonial economy. And this, continued to exist in most colonies in various forms in the 1930s and after the Second World War, even after the Second World War. So then the ELO came and tried to address this problem. While the organization's main objective was to develop and establish common and universal labor standards, the problem was that these standards were only universal in the sense that they applied to all states that signed the convention. If the states didn't sign, it didn't apply. And even then, they could use a so-called colonial clause laid down in Article 35 of the ILO Constitution, and they could exempt their mandate territories and their dependent territories and their colonies from these standards. That was allowed in the ILO Constitution. And under these conditions, which from the outset did not promise equal treatment for workers in the colonies, the ILO set up a committee of experts on the subject of native labor in 1926, and they tried to address sort of the issue of slavery and so-called slavery-like conditions. And the first task of the committee of experts was to prepare this forced labor convention, which was adopted 4 years later, and which we also know today. However, before this convention took on the form it is known today, the working group I'm addressing here first had to clarify fundamental questions to which the experts came up with very different answers. They had to see what was forced labor, what practices of forced labor existed, and what restrictions should be there on the duration, scope, and frequency of labor assignments, and how should it be remunerated, and how could it be ethically justified on another level. From the outset, there was a consensus that an immediate abolition of forced labor, be it on the basis of labor shortage, the supposed stabilizing mission of the colonial powers, and was unthinkable. And it was still strongly connected with this racial ideology of the lazy African that hindered the ILO sort of to adopt a stricter policy. Two topics from this pool of considerations I will pick up to show the dealing of the ILO with forced labor at this time, and their reference to racist stereotypes. I use the internal minutes for the first meeting of the Commission of Experts, which took place in 1927. And it's very clear it was that these discussions were always permeated by racist lines of argumentation. I'm sorry, I have to change mine here. It's very clear that these discussions were always influenced by racist lines of argumentation and have to be viewed in connection with the discourse on the African laziness I described in the beginning of the paper. They identified five types of forced labor that were still widespread at the time. So labor as tribute, prestation, the so-called second part of the annual military draft, which was also forced labor, and then panel labor. And the first example I will address is the question of distance between the labor deployment area and the forced laborer's hometown. The ILO thought there should be the principle no forced worker should be taken to a greater distance than X days travel from his home, and he should be permitted to return there at stated intervals. So as already explained, there was a constant labor shortage for colonial governments, and workers are forcibly recruited and had to migrate to places where they were needed, to public workplaces. And so you had a migration flow of male forced laborers. At the same time, you had the idea that the African and his family were not dependent on salary, as the laborers still had the resources at home in the village that they could access at any time. And this was, of course, a fiction, but it was maintained by the colonial rulers in order to ignore the problem of unemployment. And if you look at this discussion, then most of the experts argued that the legal restriction on distance should be not taken and should be prevented as long as sufficient food was provided for the workers. And on the other side, the ILO wanted to have a certain distance, and they expressed this agreement, and they thought it was not so much about distance, but about the right of the workers to limited periods of home leave. But sort of the colonial experts didn't want to do that. They ignored sort of the need of the workers, and the ignorance with some of the experts treated the workers and the realities of their lives becomes very clear in the discussion. You can see that this panel is an interface between colonial administration. They wanted to have the exploitability of workers on one hand, and then you have the philanthropic groups, and they wanted to better the conditions of workers. So what you see here is the dilemma of the ILO in trying to better the treatment of the workers. A second example I will attend to is the payment of overtime. The ILO proposal was hours worked in excess of the normal working day or normal working week should be remunerated at rates higher than normal rates. And that was also met with much criticism by the experts. They referred to the black, okay, how many minutes? Yeah, it's fine. They referred back to the black working habits I cited in the beginning that would inevitably lead to an abuse of the system and a sharp increase in the number of overtime hours due to the poor work ethic of Black people. And one expert even described the colonies as spaces who had no taste for work. It's very clear, it shows how the interests of the free Black workers were played off against those of the forced laborers, and how the experts' actual task of curbing forced labor regimes as far as possible was reduced to a sort of absurdity. And now to my concluding remarks. The common stereotypes and racist attributions that had a lasting impact on the relationships between colonial powers and colonized workers in the 20th century. Referring back to the so-called African laziness, colonial officials staged the compulsion to work that they exercised through labor tributes and prestations as a supposed achievement of civilization. And the ILO, as I showed, tried to regulate this, the violent forced labor regimes, by setting up such commissions, a commission of experts, and they prepared the Forced Labor Convention. But when you look at the discussions selected here, it becomes apparent that they all tried to uphold forced labor regimes and that they based their recommendations on racist attribution. Ideas of the supposed education for work found their way into the internal work of the Commission and the discourse of the ILO. And I think this gives quite a good example for the production of enduring inequalities. You could also refer to Charles Tilly here. And when I see that, and I mean, this is now an African example, but if I see it in this Asian context here, it would be maybe interesting to look at racist stereotypes of Asian coolies and how they are sort of treated and how people are handling this. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.